There's a point in every relationship where the scales of power can shift dramatically. And often, the person who seems like the most unshakable, the most aloof, the avoidant, feels like they're the one with all the control. They pull away, they withhold, they test. But here's the truth. The avoidant only has power as long as the empath is still giving. Because the super empath has a superpower. They can give and give with an open heart. They can love with a depth that feels bottomless. But the moment they recognize that their love is being taken for granted, something extraordinary happens. They go ice cold. And when the super empath goes cold, it's not anger, it's not drama, it's clarity. It's the clarity of realizing I don't need to beg for crumbs when I am capable of baking the whole cake myself. That's the moment the avoidant loses everything. Not because the empath stopped caring, but because they finally remembered who they are. So if you've ever found yourself giving endlessly to someone who can't or won't meet you halfway, remember this. Your strength isn't in convincing them to change. Your strength is in knowing when to turn off the tap. And when you do, you won't lose them, they'll lose you. And that's a loss they won't recover from. The avoidant thrives only while the empath continues to give. This is the unspoken truth in many relationships where one person leads with love, generosity, and openness, while the other person seems to pull away, guard their heart, and withhold affection. The dynamic can feel lopsided, almost like a dance where only one partner is moving to the music while the other stands still. The empath keeps pouring in energy, time, and effort, believing that if they just love harder, stay longer, or remain more patient, eventually the avoidant will meet them halfway. And for a while, it seems to work. The avoidant appears to hold the upper hand because they are the one deciding how much intimacy to allow, how much closeness to tolerate, and when to withdraw. But here's the hidden mechanism. The avoidant doesn't actually hold the power, they are borrowing it. They're borrowing it from the empath's endless supply of giving. As long as the empath continues to invest emotionally, the avoidant feels validated in their distance. They know the empath will be there tomorrow, even if they disappear today. They sense the patience, the tolerance, the willingness to understand. The avoidant is sustained not by their own actions, but by the safety net the empath provides. The irony is that the avoidant's independence, the very thing they pride themselves on, is only possible because someone else is holding the emotional space for the relationship. The empath often underestimates the value of what they bring to the table. Their presence is like oxygen, so consistent, so vital that the avoidant forgets to notice it. And like oxygen, it's only when it's gone that the absence becomes unbearable. The avoidant thrives in this dynamic because the empath keeps showing up with softness, forgiveness, and emotional depth, even in the face of rejection. The empath's love gives the avoidant permission to retreat because they never fear total abandonment. They sense the empath will cushion the fall. This is why the balance feels so skewed. The avoidant looks like they're in control, when in fact their control is dependent. It's dependent on the empath's willingness to continue giving without receiving in equal measure. The empath holds the true currency of connection, intimacy, care, presence. But because they keep handing it over freely, the avoidant mistakes it for a given, something that requires no reciprocity. The avoidant doesn't realize that their strength is conditional, built entirely on the foundation of someone else's generosity. Once you see this clearly, the illusion breaks. The avoidant's supposed power isn't real. It evaporates the moment the empath recognizes that their giving is not being valued and they withdraw it. Because the truth is, the avoidant cannot thrive in emptiness. They cannot maintain distance if there is no one still waiting on the other side of that distance. Their silence only works as long as there's someone listening. Their withholding only feels effective as long as there's someone eager to receive. And the second the empath stops playing that role, the avoidance sense of control crumbles. A super empath's true power lies in their ability to detach completely. For so long, the empath's strength is seen in their capacity to love, to forgive, to keep trying when others would give up. They are the ones who stay up late to listen, who compromise even when they're exhausted, who carry the weight of both people's emotions when the other person refuses to engage. This seems like their defining trait, an endless well of compassion. But beneath that compassion lies something even more powerful, something many people overlook until it happens. The empath can turn it all off. Unlike the avoidant, whose withdrawal is often a reflex born out of fear, the empath's withdrawal is a conscious decision. It is a choice made with clarity when they finally realize that their efforts are being wasted. This detachment doesn't look like coldness in the way an avoidance detachment does. It doesn't come with games, manipulation, or an attempt to punish. Instead, it comes with a quiet, unshakable calm. The empath doesn't raise their voice, they don't chase, they don't beg for change. They simply stop investing. Their energy, which once poured so freely into someone who resisted it, gets redirected inward or toward people who can actually reciprocate. It's not an act of revenge, it's an act of self-preservation. And because it is so deliberate, it has an impact the avoidant never expects. The avoidant is accustomed to pulling away and still being pursued. They rely on the empath's persistence, on their need to fix and heal and hold everything together. But when the empath detaches, all of that disappears overnight. The calls stop. The forgiveness doesn't come so easily. The patience runs dry. Suddenly, the avoidant is faced with a silence that is not negotiable, a distance that isn't a tactic but a permanent shift. What makes this so powerful is that the empath detaches not out of weakness, but out of strength. They have enough self-worth to know that they will no longer trade their energy for someone else's avoidance. This moment is transformative because it reveals the true depth of the empath's resilience. To love deeply and then to walk away without bitterness requires incredible strength. Many people confuse attachment with power, thinking that the one who clings the longest is the strongest. But in reality, the empath's greatest strength is knowing when to let go with grace. That detachment sends a message louder than any argument or confrontation could. I no longer need to participate in this dynamic. I am enough on my own. And this is why the empath's ability to detach completely is a superpower. It's not about giving less love, it's about channeling love wisely. Once the empath makes this choice, the avoidant loses the stage on which they've been performing. The push-pull game collapses because one side has stopped playing, and in that collapse, the empath stands tall, not as someone hardened, but as someone free. When the empath goes cold, it's not punishment, it's clarity and self-respect. People often mistake the empath's withdrawal for some kind of calculated move, as if they are trying to teach the avoidant a lesson or make them regret their behavior. But that's not what is happening. The empath isn't trying to manipulate or seek revenge. They're not interested in playing games because games require energy, and by this point, the empath has no energy left to give. What looks like coldness from the outside is actually the empath reaching a state of pure clarity. They see the situation for what it really is, without the rose-colored filter of hope or the endless loop of excuses. The confusion lifts, and in that clarity, they reclaim their self-respect. For so long, the empath has likely bent over backward to keep the connection alive. They've justified poor treatment, rationalized the avoidance distance, and convinced themselves that if they just wait longer, love harder, or remain more patient, things will get better. But clarity cuts through all of that. It's the sudden recognition that no amount of giving can make up for someone else's unwillingness to meet them halfway. It's the realization that love should not be one-sided labor. And in that moment, the empath doesn't feel angry. They feel done. Done with chasing, done with trying to explain their worth, done with pouring energy into a container that leaks. This shift looks like coldness to the avoidant because it is such a stark contrast from what they're used to. The warmth, the openness, the eagerness to forgive gone. The avoidant feels the absence and mistakes it for cruelty, but in reality, it's simply balance being restored. The empath is no longer overextending themselves. They are standing in a place of neutrality where they are no longer emotionally entangled in the avoidance push-pull dynamic. That neutrality feels icy, but it is actually peace. Self-respect is the driving force here. The empath realizes that continuing to invest in someone who does not reciprocate is a betrayal of themselves. To keep begging for love when you are capable of giving so much is to shrink your own value. Clarity awakens the understanding that self-respect means choosing not to participate in dynamics that drain you. And when the empath steps into that self-respect, everything changes. Their boundaries solidify. Their standards rise. They no longer accept breadcrumbs when they deserve the banquet. This is why the empath's coldness is not about punishment, it's about liberation. They aren't closing their heart, they are redirecting it. They aren't shutting down, they are stepping up. And once they do, the avoidant loses the very leverage they thought they had, because the avoidant cannot control someone who is no longer seeking their approval. They cannot manipulate someone who is no longer emotionally invested, and that's when the avoidant realizes the truth. The coldness wasn't meant to hurt them. It was simply the empath choosing themselves at last. An empath doesn't need validation from an avoidant. They can create fulfillment independently. This is one of the greatest realizations an empath comes to after years of pouring into someone who withholds. For so long, the empath believes that if they can just prove their worth through their love, through their patience, through their consistency, the avoidant will eventually acknowledge them. They wait for the day when the avoidant says the words, gives the reassurance, or finally offers the intimacy they've been craving. But that need for validation slowly transforms into exhaustion because it's a cycle with no end. The avoidant holds back precisely because they know the empath will continue giving, and the empath continues giving because they're hoping the avoidant will one day reciprocate. What breaks this cycle is the recognition that the avoidant's validation was never needed in the first place. The empath doesn't actually require someone else to tell them they are lovable, worthy, or enough. They carry those truths within themselves, even if it takes time to see it clearly. The strength of an empath has always been in their ability to generate deep, authentic love. That love doesn't disappear when the avoidant withholds it. It doesn't stop existing just because it isn't acknowledged. The empath's love is a resource they own. And the moment they choose to turn some of that love inward, they realize they can create fulfillment without anyone else's permission. This is a turning point. When the empath begins to draw joy, peace, and strength from their own life rather than from someone else's response to them, the dynamic with the avoidant collapses. The avoidant has nothing to withhold anymore because the empath isn't waiting for their scraps of attention. The validation that once held the empath hostage loses all power. And what emerges is freedom. The freedom to live, love, and thrive without being tied to someone else's inconsistency. Fulfillment for the empath becomes self-generated. They find it in pursuing passions, building meaningful friendships, creating goals, and honoring their own well-being. The space that was once filled with longing for the avoidant is now filled with growth, creativity, and purpose. And the irony is, the avoidant often begins to notice this shift and feel threatened by it, because when the empath no longer seeks validation, the avoidant loses their position of control. They can no longer dangle closeness like a prize, because the empath isn't playing that game anymore. This realization doesn't make the empath harder, it makes them stronger. It doesn't close their heart, it opens it to healthier connections. They understand that true fulfillment cannot come from someone who withholds love. It can only come from within, and from those who are capable of meeting them fully. The avoidant was never the source of the empath's value. The empath was the source all along, and when that truth sinks in, validation from the avoidant becomes irrelevant. The empath doesn't wait to be chosen, they choose themselves. The real shift in power happens when the empath chooses themselves, leaving the avoidant with nothing. For so long, the avoidant has believed they hold the advantage in the relationship. They withdraw when things get too close, knowing the empath will come running after them. They keep intimacy at arm's length, believing it makes them untouchable. They ration out their affection like breadcrumbs, trusting the empath will always accept even the smallest piece. This dynamic only works because the empath continues to choose the relationship over themselves. The moment that changes, the entire structure collapses. When the empath chooses themselves, it isn't a loud declaration or a dramatic exit. It often begins quietly. It shows up in the way they stop chasing, the way they stop explaining, the way they stop bending their needs to keep someone else comfortable. It looks like spending more time investing in their own peace, in their own joy, rather than waiting on the avoidant to deliver it. The shift may be subtle at first, but the impact is seismic, because suddenly the avoidant is no longer the center of the empath's universe. The avoidant has built their identity in the relationship around being the one who controls the distance. But when the empath steps away and places themselves at the center, that distance loses all of its meaning. Silence no longer works as a weapon because the empath isn't listening for answers anymore. Emotional unavailability no longer feels like power because the empath isn't waiting for connection to be handed down in fragments. By choosing themselves, the empath dismantles the avoidant's illusion of control. This choice doesn't come from anger. It comes from self-awareness. The empath realizes that staying in a cycle of deprivation is not loyalty, it's self-abandonment. And once they see this truth clearly, they can't unsee it. Choosing themselves is about honoring their worth and creating a life where their needs are met with consistency and respect. It's about finally refusing to shrink in order to fit into someone else's comfort zone. The avoidant, for the first time, is left with nothing to hold on to. They lose the attention they took for granted, the devotion they assumed was endless, and the warmth they believed would always return. In its place is a void, one they can no longer fill on their terms. The avoidant may try to pull the empath back into the old dance, but it doesn't work anymore. Because once the empath chooses themselves, they can't unchoose. That shift is permanent. And this is the moment the real balance of power is revealed. It was never the avoidant who held the upper hand. It was always the empath. The ability to give love freely is a greater power than the ability to withhold it. And when the empath chooses to turn that power inward, the avoidant loses the very foundation of their influence. What's left is the truth: the avoidant never had control. The empath simply hadn't stepped fully into theirs until now. And so, when the super empath finally goes ice cold, it's not an ending born from bitterness. It's the beginning of something greater. It's the reclaiming of self, the rediscovery of worth, and the moment the entire dynamic flips. The avoidant doesn't lose because the empath wanted to hurt them. They lose because the empath chose to no longer hurt themselves. The truth is, love is never meant to be a battle for crumbs. Love is not meant to be earned through endurance or bargained for with silence. Love is a partnership where two people meet each other fully, and when one person refuses to show up, the most powerful thing the other can do is stand up, step out, and choose themselves. That is the moment the avoidant loses everything, and the empath finally gains their freedom. Thank you for listening, thank you for your openness, and thank you for honoring your own worth by being here. May you leave with the reminder that your value is not defined by who withholds from you, but by the love and strength you carry within yourself. Take that with you, live it boldly, and never again settle for less than what your soul deserves. Goodbye, and thank you.